Hey, and welcome again to another episode of Nutanix Weekly. I'm your host, Phil Sellers. I'm the practice director for Modern Data Center at XenTegra. This is one of our mini podcasts. I lose count how many we actually have and produce on a regular basis anymore. But we like to call this, along with our blog posts and other things, content with context, because we like to take and review things that have been posted online and then bring the real world to them, our real world experiences, those of my co-hosts. And speaking of co-hosts today, I've got a little different treat. We've got Kurt Telep. Kurt is the field CTO for healthcare at Nutanix, and Kurt and I go a long way back. We share a bond over something called Nutanix Community Edition. Um, Kurt's somewhat the head tinkerer for Community Edition, a huge champion for that special release of Nutanix. But Kurt, it's great to have you on the podcast.
It's awesome to be here, Phil. And it's funny. I was just at an event in Maryland yesterday, and I prided myself on not mentioning Community Edition at every single speaking event that I do. But yes, thank you. I do appreciate the shout out for Community Edition. It is a big passion of mine. Besides Community Edition, right? So at Nutanix, I kind of have a really cool role. So I'm the field CTO for healthcare. I'm a member of the CTA team. What I love is that I kind of span the range from the field engineers, marketing, engineering on the back end, alliances. I really get to be your one-stop shop of where does healthcare fit? What do we do with healthcare? Whether it's a technical conversation, whether it's a strategic conversation, I basically get as far into it as the customer or the rep or the engineer needs me to be, right? And it's great because I do have a technical background, right? I've been in IT for over 25 years. 15 of that has been specifically working in healthcare and with healthcare accounts. I've been yelled at by charge nurses in ERs when wristband printers weren't working. I've been director of storage engineering for, large data center firms. So I've kind of got this really wide range of experience that, I kind of bring to our everyday conversations around healthcare here at Nutanix.
Well, we were talking a little bit about this before we kicked off today, but um, listeners can't see the background that I see as we're on Zoom together. I was sharing with Kurt, there's a legitimacy to when Kurt's on a call with you because he has a full electronics workbench behind him. And we're talking about some of his passions outside of work. And it gets used. It's a real thing. It's not just a background. So he's the real deal when we're talking about technology. And I agree, you've got a huge, wide, varied background that you bring to the table. And that's a huge benefit for our customers, your customers that you're working with, because you're seeing things from a more global perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Uh, and I think that's one of the key things that makes me effective within my particular role. But I think that's something that, as engineers, many of us bring to the table. And I think some of us forget to bring it to the table when we talk to customers, right? Um, there's something to be said for being there at 2 o'clock in the morning when, you were in a really bad situation as a systems administrator and knowing and empathizing with the pain your customer's been through and then saying, hey, here's a way I can help, right? I joke, I really have been yelled at by a charge nurse at a hospital because I couldn't get her wristband printer working. Um, but that's an experience, though, that taught me how important it is for those end clinical users, right? And it's not just in healthcare, it's really the end user working in a factory. The fact that if barcode scanners are unavailable in a distribution center, that may mean that somebody doesn't get to go to their daughter's play, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it's bringing the human side of what we do in IT and then being able to tie that back to business challenges, business objectives. How am I more efficient? How do I get my time back? Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's really one of the crux of everybody that works in IT's goal here, especially lately, is we want to be more efficient in the things that we do, not because we all want to really do more work. It's because we want to be able to not have to be working 24/7, 365, irregardless of which vertical we're in.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting. You talk about other verticals, but in healthcare, it is a little different. You are literally sometimes dealing with life and death.
Yeah,
And so that's a completely different context. It's also one of the most challenging compliance environments in all of business. So
definitely.
the,
Right.
the, the challenges there are exponential compared to other places. And oh yeah, let's add some razor thin margins. And then you've got just an amazing mix, right? It's
I,
tough.
I I had the CTO share with me recently of a health system out west. He said, I can't raise prices. Like it's with everything that's going on today in the world of virtualization and hypervisors and stacks, right? Like you can't get more money out of healthcare. How do healthcare organizations actually make a profit is with elective procedures, right?
Mhm.
You're not going to get more money from people coming into the ER. You're not going to make more money. You're not going to be able to change that bottom line, and you can't raise your prices, right? In many cases, the health system's not even setting its own pricing, right?
Yeah, that's
Um,
up to the insurance partners or the government or again other agencies outside of themselves.
Yeah. So a lot of times it's, we always used to talk about, the value of anything that you're working with a customer on is how does it reduce risk? How does it reduce cost? Or how does it increase their profitability? Right. Well, in healthcare, it's really the first two are the most important, right? Like
Mhm.
how do I reduce risk? Right. Because and just to make sure that we clear the air and don't be like, fear mongers, listen, if the IT system in a healthcare environment goes offline, people don't just start falling dead, right? Everybody doesn't
Yeah.
flatline because their GEIOT heart monitor doesn't report back, right? Every single health system has paper processes in order, to handle those situations. They're not going to get the same quality of care, right? There's definitely going to be challenges. Everything's going to slow down, right? Which is going to directly impact patients, but people aren't just going to be keeling over, but we don't ever want them to be in that situation. And sometimes, especially in healthcare, we always talk in healthcare about the electronic medical record systems, or we talk about the PACS environment for imaging, or we talk about end user compute, right? The way that everybody comes in. People forget the hundreds of other tiny little applications that glue all of that together, right? Whether it's like HL7 routers, if it's just even things as simple as file shares that are used for dropping data and then being picked up by another application, EDI tools. There's a lot
Mhm.
of things that make up healthcare that keep it running. And in many cases, it's those environments have grown over time and they've become this spider web of applications that nobody really knows who owns and runs everything. Nobody knows what's connected or why it's connected. Um, and that's where things start to become even more critical from things like a simplification and a high availability and an efficiency perspective, right? How can I keep all those other bits and pieces that we haven't focused
Yeah.
on safely running?
Well, and call back to your charge nurse, right? The friction of a printer not working, how does that affect patient care? How does it back up the ER or triage and intake and things like that? Because that's a compensating control. That wristband identifies the person. It makes sure that the correct things are going to the correct people. It is a part of that overall process. And,
Mhm.
and I know with our experience being an EUC centric partner, we see all those peripherals and stuff that are at that endpoint. It may be cameras now to capture a photo of the person during intake. It may be electronic signatures on their topaz. It may
Yeah.
be a credit card reader and a scanner for the insurance card. Those clinical stations at the intake desk are probably the most complicated thing that we deal with sometimes. The clinical environment, once you're, you know, actually checked in, is probably easier than that front desk or the billing clerk or because they've got so many things hanging off a machine.
You're 100% correct, right? And, a lot of those tools were not originally built to increase efficiency, but more to increase data accuracy, right?
Mhm.
Like when you've got somebody hand keying in personal information versus just scanning an ID card, right? Yeah, we've added this technology peripheral, but we've also gained a whole lot of accuracy there.
Mhm.
What one of the challenges in healthcare also ties to data gravity and latency and applications,
Yeah.
right? I've worked with really one of the great things about the healthcare vertical at Nutanix is we just cover all healthcare, right? If you see patients, right, that's under Nutanix Healthcare. Whether you're Springford Family Dental in Royersford, Pennsylvania, right, who's got 2 doctors and 6 hygienists and a 3-node cluster in the basement, all the way up to some of the largest healthcare organizations in the United States that run Nutanix as their platform, right? We cover it all, right? So when I start to look at what are organizations, healthcare organizations doing when they're talking about where am I going next with IT? How do I make things more efficient? Do I go into the cloud? Don't I go into the cloud? What goes to the cloud? The first thing we always want to talk about is healthcare application rationalization, right? Because uh, something like a NICU monitoring tool is super latency sensitive, right? That
Mm.
still needs to live on prem, right? I just can't, or in many cases, you know, PAX environments where I need to keep my short-term storage that still needs to live on prem because I got to be able to get access to those images instantaneously or as quickly as possible, right? Maybe archive workloads though, like I've got an old EMR that's still hanging around because we got acquired or I acquired another health system,
Mm.
but I still got to keep that EMR around for archival use case. Well, maybe that's something that we want to talk about pushing up into the cloud or pushing off into another platform versus keeping that in my most high performance on-prem environment. And as healthcare systems have been admittedly being purchased, there's been acquisitions, there's been mergers, there's been investment, there's been divesting of health systems, right? I feel like every couple of years a lot of health systems just throw everything in a box, shake it up and decide which ones they want to roll out to use. And all the C-level execs all get shuffled around. uh, it's always interesting to see, well, how do I rationalize the application I run? What stays where it needs to be? And what can I move to make it more efficient, irregardless of what
Yeah.
size that healthcare organization is.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about, legacy applications, things that have been inherited and are still required in that archive state. It's also really hard to rationalize refactoring something like that to
Mhm.
move it to cloud. And
Yeah.
so you really want to maintain status quo with a lot of those older applications, which means where do I host that in a place that's going to have the same uptime and availability and all the same characteristics as on-prem, but
Mhm.
giving me the flexibility of cost or locality or consolidation and things like that.
And that's where you have to look at some of those older applications. And yes, there are tools that healthcare application consumers can use to pull data out, create an archive of it. But a lot of times there's that old Cerner Oracle database that's running in the corner, or an old Meditech environment that they need to keep around. And the challenges start to be not just that application, but the infrastructure, all the infrastructure components supporting it, right? Like, hey, I need to keep this around, but it's still running Windows 2008, right?
Yeah,
And I can't
yeah,
upgrade if I upgrade Windows, I got to upgrade the application, but I don't really have a contract to support that application anymore. So now I've got this Windows 2008 VM. Well, how do I also maintain my HIPAA compliance and my
hmm,
PCI compliance, right? And that's one of those things. Whereas Nutanix, we come in and have a conversation about using microsegmentation as a tool to
right,
wrap that old virtual machine. Hey, we put a flow policy on that virtual machine. Um, when somebody needs to use it, you simply update the policy or change the category. The user hops in, uses it, and then when they're done, you flip the category back, and that VM is completely locked down again, right?
yeah,
And we can work with you in order to identify the risk and the documentation of that, so that becomes HIPAA compliant, right? But then I could take something like that, which is server 2008, even older, right? Those aren't really easy to move into the cloud, right? You're
right,
not going to find a server 2008 AMI at AWS, right? Uh, but that's where we can bring in things like NC2, right? Because with Nutanix cloud clusters, well, shoot, if it runs on Nutanix and AHV on-prem, it's going to run on NC2 up in the cloud, right? So we can then give that availability to that virtual machine. We can replicate that virtual machine and you can stick it up in the cloud in a corner and maybe you hibernate that entire cluster off. And then you
yeah,
only bring it up when somebody has an actual request. Maybe it's for legal purposes, whatever reason, there's a reason to bring that and rehydrate that back up, right? There's lots of technology within the Nutanix stack that we bring into healthcare that simplifies those processes and makes it so that data becomes much more on demand versus saying, oh, I got to go back to tape and restore this and try to rebuild this entire environment from scratch. And yes, there are still health organizations that are going to tape. Much to my chagrin, they are still out there, right?
Yeah,
Healthcare is one of the slowest to adopt new technologies because, in general, healthcare is really risk averse, right? So,
absolutely.
the ways that we can use things like NC2 to enable those risk averse organizations to leverage new technologies that are in the cloud that become available has really been valuable, especially around some of those archive use cases.
Well, and what I love about this conversation is we're talking in a healthcare context, but I come from, a customer background. Coming into XenTegra 2 years ago, I worked for a large insurance company, and we weren't necessarily healthcare focused. We did some group benefits, but we
Mhm.
were a broker. We did mostly property and casualty, but we were merger and acquisition heavy. These are the same things I was talking about with my leadership, with my business partners as well. Do we keep this historical system around? How do we mitigate the risk of, vulnerabilities and things on an older operating system that's out of support today? We chose microsegmentation to be able to solve some of those challenges. We reduced the risk profile
Mhm.
by using the technology as an enabler. And again, to your point, sometimes you can relocate these things, not refactor any things, and then just shut it down until it's actually needed for cost savings and things. So burstability in the cloud becomes a huge asset to you.
Mhm.
Burstability is a great concept, but it's really hard to implement in reality for most applications. They're just not built in a way that you can burst.
Yeah,
So
and
again, you get some of the goodness by abstracting and adding Nutanix as a layer there between the bare metal and the cloud.
yeah, and especially when you're and again, I'll talk in the healthcare context, but we see this in multiple industries when you've got mergers and acquisitions going on,
Mm,
right? One of the key things that you need to handle when you've acquired another organization, as much due diligence as an organization does, right? Especially when you're acquiring a much smaller organization. Not everybody is as forward thinking as Springford Family Dental is, right?
yeah.
You may run into, hey, the owner's nephew's son was the guy who happened to do something with IT, right? And you need to really stabilize that environment. You don't really know what's in there. You really just want to get the data and the applications out of whatever they have and into something that's going to be a stable platform. That's where things like NC2, that's where things like having that burst ability, the ability to very quickly get that infrastructure up and running and just lift and shift and then
Mhm.
figure it out now that you're at least in a known safe place, right?
Well, and you hit a huge one for us. Over the acquisitions that I helped digest for my organization, we acquired a few firms that had a past issue in their
Mm-hmm.
environment. Maybe some sort of a cyber type issue in their past, and so in those situations, you may want to be more prescribed. You may not necessarily just want to lift and shift. You may want to do a rebuild in place. And then how do you do that without additional hardware? And how do you do that? And so this flexibility, this agility really becomes a huge advantage to you as an organization. You also touched on something that I really want to talk about, and that's data gravity. Uh, because this is huge in multiple industries, but especially in healthcare,
Yeah.
because it's so compliance driven. Data gravity also dictates what we're able to do with that data because of where it lives.
Yeah.
What are the implications there as you think about that in your healthcare customers and new technology coming out like AI and how it affects this data set?
So, data gravity, for those that kind of don't know the term, right? Data gravity is the idea that I have a piece of data and maybe this data is latency driven. I need to keep it close to where I'm going to process and manage the data. Or it's just so large that I can't move it around. It's truly like a weighty, it has mass, right?
Mhm.
And in healthcare, usually we're talking about things like PACS data, right? Super
Mhm.
large, detailed images. Hospital goes and buys a brand new modality. I will tell you, back in the days when I sold storage, right? I'd be super excited when one of my customers would buy
Yeah.
a new, mammogram modality. because I knew the new ones, it was going to go 10x and how much storage that they were going to need. And that was definitely going to drive up things like the size of arrays. But that's a lot of data that all lives in one place. Now, when we start looking at other uses for that data, if we roll back 10 years ago, PACS was really just about storing images and having them available for when somebody called for them. Nowadays, every single piece of data that we have within the health system has potential to be used in order to
Mhm.
provide better care for future patients or you yourself as a patient. So all of a sudden, I'm doing more than just putting this data on slow and cheap archive drives, right? Like I want to process this data. I want to start to churn on this data. I want to start using things like AI and building models that leverage this data for training purposes. Well, when I need this massive, quote, massive AI infrastructure in order to do that, what am I going to do? Take that to every single one of my facilities? No, right? What we're starting to look at is the opportunities to do high performance compute processing in a much smaller footprint and bring it directly to the data, right? I can do things like deploy a GPT in a box or
Mhm.
Nutanix Enterprise AI and put it, in for you in a rack right next to where my PACS environment is, right next to where my data lives. I don't have to build racks and racks and racks of hardware anymore in order to get the
Right.
value out of that data that I did before.
Yeah, and again, you say the weightiness of it or the latency sensitivity. I also bring compliance. Some people are just not comfortable with their data living outside of the four walls of their facility. This being their crown jewels, it's another use case for the on-prem GPT in the box and learning from that data. But I think healthcare is unique in the fact that we do maintain so much of this data, and PACS is a great example of that. These diagnostic images across all sorts of different conditions is a training set, is and potential um, increase in the ability to help
Right.
not necessarily diagnose, but
Right.
maybe raise potential issues for the trained eye to investigate.
Well, and there's the sexy side of AI within healthcare, and that's what people want to hear and talk about, right? It's the
Yeah.
hey, the AI reviews the chest x-ray that was taken for somebody who had a pneumonia diagnosis to validate the diagnosis. And maybe the radiologist doesn't see the shadow that's higher up that may be indicating of early onset lung cancer or something like that, right? Like
Yeah.
those are the big wins that we see. But the ones that we don't always talk about are some of those real back office use cases in healthcare,
Mhm.
right? Where healthcare organizations can take the same types of data, right? And maybe it's analyzing diagnosis codes. Are they actually properly billing and coding for what the work that they've done, or for the imaging, or for what's being seen in the images, right? And a lot
Mhm.
of that is even pulling out of EMR data, right?
Yeah.
Like it's really easy. Well, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's less of a challenge to do things like anonymize PACS data, right? You're updating the DICOM metadata. Maybe it's a redaction within the image. It's very automatable to then make that data set available for AI training generically. But actual EMR patient data is much more difficult to do that with, right?
Yeah.
Because every single part of your healthcare record typically can be tied back to you, no matter how big or small that healthcare facility is, right? A healthcare record from a dental office carries just as much PII as a
Mhm.
healthcare record from a major hospital, right? So when you're looking at different use cases for things like AI or machine learning processing, you want to try to keep those closer to your data, which you're keeping as secure as you can. In many cases, that means on-prem in your own core data center, and not
Yeah.
extracting that data and then trying to get it up into some other location where that data is going to get processed, right?
Yeah, and it strikes me healthcare is an interesting place when we talk about edge too, right? Because you mentioned neonatal sensors, but even other general diagnostic things like maybe blood pressure or heart rate monitoring and things like that. There's telemetry
Yes.
everywhere in this environment, and so I think about all the data created in a smart car,
Hmm.
connected cities and videos. healthcare is a microcosm of all of this telemetry too. And
Yeah,
I'm curious
IoT
to see where's that going.
IoT in healthcare has been exploding over the past few years, right? So at first it was connected tools and connected monitoring so that instead of just having it make a really loud beep in the room, right, it was
Mhm.
showing up on a terminal at the nurse's station, right? Um, Now we're getting to the point where we've been talking about using things like AI at the edge to be able to identify early signs based on monitor output, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Almost every single monitor patch wire that's hooked up to a patient typically today is going to be connected to some type of connected device, which we now have a stream of data that's feeding into your EMR or feeding into a system that's physically local to where that device is. Now, if we can start to build models that have predictive analytics that tie to when emergencies may occur for a patient, right? Well, now if we can layer that right next to where that data is coming in, we can start using the AI to monitor it and provide more backup for that nurse or that collection of nurses that are working in those stations, in those facilities, right?
Yeah.
Which is going to lead to better patient outcomes. And being able to do that on the edge is really important, right? Because a lot of times that individual hospital or that individual, floor location data closet might not have a full air conditioned data center.
Right.
We're really about talking about deploying, today some of those healthcare ISVs are deploying just a single node ESX server and they're running a bunch of VMs on it, right?
Yeah.
Tomorrow we hope that to be a AHV node in there that's running all of those virtual machines on it, or even better, a small, Kubernetes cluster that's actually running those applications at the edge, right?
Right.
But we want to make sure that the edge is easy. And when you look at health systems that have, in some cases, hundreds of very small facilities that have those capabilities, centralized management is one,
Mhm.
consistency of management, automation of management starts to become extremely important, right? It's not just, we don't want to have people that have to go out and individual touch every single one of these at every single facility. We should be able to do it all from one place.
Yeah, this is another example, or strikes me as an example of the tides of IT, right? We were heavily consolidated with mainframes and things like that. Then we went to client server and things were distributed again. And then things have consolidated again and then distributed again. And this is that redistribution out again. Because the trend had been consolidation of data centers and like you said, larger and larger healthcare entities. My wife works for one that happens to have 40 plus different hospitals.
Mhm.
They don't have a data center at every one of those. There's
Nope.
been consolidation. It doesn't make financial sense. But to your point, it may make a lot more sense for each floor in that hospital or each hospital to have a small cluster running some of these new services as the need to get closer to that data exists.
Yeah, and in 10 to 15 years, right? We may pull it all back again, right? I think most
Yeah,
of the being somebody who cut his teeth on mainframe and AS400, which is why,
yeah.
and we talked earlier about my love for 8-bit computers from the 80s. Um, you know, Typically what's driven a lot of those trends out and in has been network connectivity and the availability of
Mhm.
high performance network connectivity, right? When we didn't have great network connectivity, we pushed things out into the edge, right? Because the data had gravity, because the
Mhm.
user needed access to that data very quickly, but we couldn't pull it from that central location fast enough. And then we got better connectivity, which said, well, wait a minute, now I can wrap my arms around this, bring this local, and I can either process it all local or I can do work with it local, but I have enough bandwidth to get out to everybody what they actually need to see when they need to see it, right? And I think that's when we saw the big explosion, like VDI, for example, right?
Yeah,
Like instead of me moving data, I'm just going to move out the screen, the keyboard, the mouse, and the USB devices, right? I think that with AI, with that data being so far out at the edge, right? We can't get those streams of data internally fast enough. And I think that we need distributed computing in order to be able to process all of that data in a meaningful way. So we're going
right.
to have it pushed out for a while. But I think once we get to the point where we're talking about terabit Ethernet connections between hospitals and the core data center, maybe we won't have a problem and we'll be able to start to recollapse some of those things again back into the core data center.
Well, just like the tides, there's always a bottleneck that we're moving around, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
As soon as you fix one bottleneck, there's another one that's
there's
going to be
another
there.
one.
You're
Yeah, and
never going to
another
get
one.
rid of every bottleneck. It's just which one are you willing to live with at this point in time,
That's
right?
exactly right. Kurt, I want to call this part one of our discussion because I've enjoyed so much of what we've talked about
Mhm.
today. I've got to have you back. We've got to talk more about healthcare. It's a huge vertical for us, as you can imagine, as a VDI centric company. That's our heritage. We've done a lot in healthcare, but as I focus in on the things that Nutanix is doing to make IT simple, to enable choice, healthcare is a great place for those things to be really valuable. That's what I'm hearing from you today is that you're driving value for healthcare organizations by enabling that choice, by giving them options on the table.
Yeah.
And that to me makes a ton of sense. With the amount of disruption we have going on in our industry, in the infrastructure space, choice and go-to partners is a huge thing for customers to seek out.
Yeah, I have a slide that I use every time I talk to customers, and it's my second slide after my title. And it always talks about one platform, right? With the
Hmm.
Nutanix having that single platform, whether you're unbelievably small, tiny single doctor facility, all the way up to a massive healthcare organization that's nationwide, right? There's one platform to manage, one platform that's going to give you all the functionality that you need, whether you're tiny or small. That freedom of choice piece then ties directly into it, making it's hard to move the ship that is a large healthcare organization. I really am curious in 3 or 4 years, what is it what projects didn't get done because we're changing hypervisors?
Right, right.
Whereas, a platform like Nutanix changing the hypervisor should not be we're putting every project on hold for a year until we figure out what we're going to do with this, right? And again, it talks to the simplicity. And then the last one that's on that slide is the customer delight piece, right?
Right.
Healthcare organizations, when things are not going well, they need to know that their vendors are behind them. We're there to support them, and that we know what we're talking about when we show up, right? That when you place a call because you've got something, because you have a NICU that doesn't have availability because of its application, because you may have a cluster that has the challenges with performance, and clinicians are saying, hey, I'm trying to do notes and this is going to reduce the number of patients that I can see, right?
Hmm.
Knowing that we can be there to stand with them to get things resolved, get them resolved quickly, and make sure that they're running as optimal as they can is something that I hold very true to my heart at Nutanix. So
Yeah. Well, and that's something across the entire organization. I shared with you before our recording started today, but I bring the support organization every time I bring a customer to Nutanix headquarters to meet with the team. Support is a big part of that conversation. You guys approach it differently. It's a huge value to the customer. And when arguably most of your competition is trying to cut costs and cut back on the way that they deliver support, this is still a very big strategic advantage to working with Nutanix. Can't underscore it
absolutely.
enough because there's going to be bad days, and we're all going to have bugs and problems. How you respond to it is the key.
Yeah.
Well, Kurt,
100%.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's you know what? It's one of the reasons that I love working here at Nutanix, being somebody who can walk into a customer and know that I never have to be there for an apology about a elongated outage that was
Mhm.
driven by a support issue is something that I'm really, really proud of every day here.
Yeah, and you talked to me a little bit offline about the difference of coming into the organization and how it's been different for you personally. That's got to be a huge um, weight off your shoulders to
Yeah,
know
I
that you've got that organization behind you.
sleep a lot better now knowing that I've got a phenomenal support organization to back me up. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, you heard it from the horse's mouth. If you're listening to this one, Kurt is great people. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the last few years. I'm absolutely dedicated to this being part one of an
Okay.
ongoing conversation. So I can't wait to have you back here on the podcast. And I thank you so much for your time.
So glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, we'll definitely do a part two. And who knows, maybe we'll turn into a part three. All right.
That'd be fantastic too. For everybody listening, I want to say thanks for spending a little time with us. I know that time is your most valuable resource. So thanks for listening. And on behalf of everybody at XenTegra, if we can ever do anything to help you move the needle, we're here for you. Have a great day, and we will talk to you on the next podcast.